Welcome back to New York Times .Earth contributing blogger Andrew Revkin. Today, we turn our attention closer to home, to Canada's oil sands. The U.S. oil industry is distancing itself from less stable areas, including the Middle East and Venezuela, and that means they'll be getting even more of their oil from us. What will that growing reliance mean for both the economy and the environment? Andrew Revkin is here to talk about that. Hi again.
Good to be with you.
Okay, Andrew, you won't be able to see this, but I want to pull up a graph for our audience to look at. I'll walk you through it. It's looking at the major sources of petroleum to the United States. So let's bring up that graphic. Here's what it shows. It shows that Canada provides your country, the U.S., with most of its petroleum. The amount it provides is almost double what Mexico does and 3 times the amount Saudi Arabia does. So by far, Canada is the biggest supplier of oil imports to the United States. Now, your president wants to slash U.S. oil imports by 1/3 over the next decade. And I'm wondering then, what would such a commitment have on Canada's market for crude exports?
Well, presumably not much at all, because the global market for oil is going to keep rising. China and India, particularly on a per capita basis, still use a fraction of the amount of oil that we do, and their economies and their populations and consumption patterns are growing. Their use of transportation is growing as well. So you're going to end up with a market that will lead to more demand for oil. With or without the U.S., I think Canada will be doing just fine in that sense. And that leads to some real challenges for environmental groups and others who are concerned about the consequences of that. It's not as if you could stop one pipeline, for example, and then have that impede the production of this really remarkable resource that humans have become pretty reliant on.
What are some of those challenges?
Well, when you burn oil, you end up with greenhouse gases, among other things. That's the first thing in looking ahead at a warming world. And it's not as if with a power plant you at least have potentially, and even there it's a tough go, the prospect of capturing the gases as they come out of your smokestack and compressing them and putting them in the ground. With millions and millions of cars around the world, you're not going to have little compressors capturing the CO2 and putting it somewhere. So transportation use of oil is a huge deal. It's a reality of our world for decades to come, and that means that is an issue that will just keep rising. And as these less conventional sources of oil, like Canada's oil or tar sands, depending on who's describing them. And here in America, there's this growing realization that along with the shale gas, there's shale oil. This is a newly appreciated resource as well. As long as that reserve, that sense of what is achievable, retrievable oil keeps growing, you're going to see more of those emissions. And then, of course, there's the energy that's required to get oil out of the ground. When you move into an arena like tar sands or oil sands, or in the States shale oil, the energy that's required to get that resource out of the ground becomes more and more, and the costs generally rise as well of just getting the fuel. So those are issues that are going to rise as well.
We talked about the importance of language in talking about these sorts of things earlier in the week, and I want to talk about the language about something you just pointed out, which is the difference between tar sands and oil sands. So walk us through the difference.
Well, it's not a pretty process. It's kind of like there's certain aspects of getting fossil fuels and getting them to market that are not pretty, and they're destructive, and they use a lot of energy and water, and it can lead to profound transformations of landscapes. This is the same in mountaintop removal of coal for mining as it is with taking these tougher kinds of oils where the petroleum is essentially it's just not as liquid, so you have to do more to it. You have to heat it, you have to mix it with chemicals or fluids to get it into a state where you can put it in a pipeline. That all comes with real hardcore, specific, concrete, on-the-ground environmental consequences. And again, it's the same as you've seen with extracting natural gas in new ways in the States is leading to a whole new environmental conversation around how to do that without impacts. And so the tar sands versus oil sands is all rhetoric. It's about labeling and trying to get people to either fear or accept, to look at the economic aspect of this resource more than the environmental. That's a normal part of how the game is played. And by the way, fracking is another term that just has, when you just say the word fracking, there's nothing particularly nice about that term, so it tends to be applied as a pejorative, and then that's how the debate goes forward.
Much of the debate is centered around the economic benefits as well. And the Canadian Energy Research Institute recently put out some numbers and said that oil sands development in Canada is expected to lead to more than 342,000 new American jobs between now and 2015. What do you make of this argument, Andrew, that developing Canada's oil sands is good for the American economy?
Well, I haven't seen that specific study, but the argument in those kinds of studies essentially is a macroeconomic argument. If you're providing a resource that stimulates economic activity or gives you, avoids a higher cost for something that's required to do work that becomes part of the economy, then you're facilitating growth of the economy in the end. And that, so that's, again, and by the way, when you get into that arena, there's a lot of conditionality and a lot of uncertainty in those kinds of studies. There's just enough that it makes everybody, gives everyone in the rhetorical debate, the political debate, the potential to come in and with their economic analysis say, yeah, but this shows you X. And that's where, as I've said earlier in the sequence of shows here, getting to the root of the question, I think, as a journalist or just as the public, you know, is really vital. Finding a way to compare study A with study B. And it gets harder though. When you're in an arena like energy and economics, where most forecasts have been routinely wrong. There was a great study a few years ago, very sobering one, in the early 2000s that looked at 50 years of energy forecasts and showed just how utterly wrong they've been. So when you're in that arena, you can kind of like make your argument and stake your points and have a hearing and have people with PhDs present there, and in the end, I think the enduring reality, as people like Václav Smil at University of Manitoba have pointed out, and it's an uncomfortable reality, is we're going to use more of what we need now, and we're not very good at sort of shifting gears to take account future risk as we go forward. The imperative of the now is a tough thing to circumvent. And right now we'll need more oil essentially before we use less later in this century.
And a lot of the talk out of the U.S. From the administration is about, you know, we should get more from Canada because it's secure. It's not like our other suppliers where there's political turmoil in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. But how does Canadian oil really measure up, Andrew, in terms of it being an alternate to those other places? Are there hidden pitfalls for Canadian oil as well?
Well, the question will remain if the U.S. ends up with a serious climate policy and cares about the carbon dioxide emissions related to fuel choices. Again, the more energy you need to use to extract and refine oil from a particular source, the more you're adding to the emissions sort of profile of that fuel. And it's some analyses show that for oil from these tough spots from the oil sands is when you add in those extra greenhouse gas emissions that are required just in the process of getting it to the tank or to the tire wheel as you're moving along, can become a serious consideration. The question there is, will the U.S. have a serious climate policy anytime soon so that added burden of greenhouse gases is accounted for? And unfortunately, there's not much of a sense that that's going to be possible anytime soon because of our ongoing issues with the domestic climate politics.
Okay, perfect segue, because I want to bring up a recent study by Oil Sands Watch, which shows GHG's greenhouse gas emissions from a barrel of oil from Canadian oil/tar sands. And it says that oil runs from 3 to as much as 7 times as high as a barrel of conventional Texas crude. Yet supporters, Andrew, cite different numbers. They say it's 5 to 15% more greenhouse gas emissions from the sands than from conventional oil. So again, we're talking about the same thing, but have different points of view and different numbers. So how do we account for that discrepancy?
Almost this precisely the same fight is going on over natural gas from fracking in the United States right now as and alternatives. And the issue there for oil specifically is whether you include in the full use of the oil, meaning the thing that really matters in the end, the brunt of emissions that come from burning gasoline or diesel come from burning the gasoline or diesel. A much smaller proportion comes from the processes that lead to getting that from the prime source, whether it's tar sands, oil sands, or whether it's from Saudi Arabia or wherever. And that, when you add in the reality that most of the CO2 emissions that we care about are coming from the actual use of the fuel, it makes that differential much, much smaller part of the equation. And there will be, going forward, probably new methods for extracting these oil from tougher environments that will be more energy efficient, or perhaps use entirely different sources of energy altogether. So I wouldn't count on that differential being the thing that really sort of becomes a driver here in the long run. In the end, it's the use of the oil, period, that is the dominant issue, not sort of the source in terms of greenhouse gas question.
Okay, Andrew, bear with me. I want to get through one more quote. It's a long one, so just have a listen to this. This is from a Business Insider from back in January. Here's what it asks. What could be better than to replace oil from unstable countries like Nigeria with oil from friendly, democratic, and nearby Canada? It sounds good, but when you think about it, the security benefits are less than they seem. Again, consider a hypothetical Nigerian civil war. How much would it matter if, before the war started, Canadian output had expanded by enough that the U.S. was no longer an importer of Nigerian crude? It would not matter very much because the global oil market operates as a single pool. Oil prices everywhere would spike as other countries scramble to replace Nigerian oil. True, there would still be logistical benefits to a short pipeline link with a stable Canada compared with a long sea route to a volatile Nigeria, but those would be of a second order of magnitude. Andrew, what do you make of the argument that the security benefits for the U.S. of getting Canadian oil are less than they're made out to be?
It's a tough situation. This gets back to the reality, as that piece laid out, that oil is a global commodity, and that the price swings, it's not like this comes back to some of the old campaigns in the States to choose where you buy your gasoline from because one company or another was a worse actor. In the end, the oil will be bought by somebody, and in the end, the price fluctuations for the different kinds of oil are a function of global economic trends and competitive markets. So there is the one security element here that really hasn't shown itself to be much of a risk was back in the 70s when OPEC, the oil producing states, could in a grand way literally turn down production and have a big influence on global prices and on our economic activity. In the States I grew up, I'm old enough that I remember the lines of cars and stuff. That still, though, going forward, I guess what this does is it kind of undercuts overall the argument that security imperative that we're sending money to Saudi Arabia in a way that would foster terrorism potentially it doesn't hold up in the long run when you have this kind of globalization of the appetite for this commodity.
Okay, Andrew, we'll have to leave it there for this evening. Thanks again.
Okay.